Drive through almost any American town today, and you'll probably pass a gas station without noticing it. A flat roof, a bright canopy, rows of fuel pumps, a convenience store selling coffee, snacks, and lottery tickets. If you've seen one, you've seen 1,000. They're designed to be familiar, predictable, efficient, almost invisible. But a century ago, gas stations were anything but ordinary. Some looked like English cottages, with steep tile roofs and brick chimneys. Others resembled Spanish villas, colonial homes, miniature Greek temples, complete with white terracotta columns. One oil company in Philadelphia even hired an architect to model a filling station after a classical temple right on a city street corner, beside ordinary houses. And in Minnesota, one of America's greatest architects designed a service station that still pumps gasoline today. Oil companies hired architects, not just engineers, to design the places where people bought gasoline. And in many towns, that wasn't optional. Local governments expected these new businesses to fit the character of the neighborhoods around them, not resemble industrial lots. Imagine that. The place where you filled your gas tank might have been one of the most beautiful buildings on the street. So what happened? Why did these architectural landmarks disappear? Why did almost every gas station in America begin to look exactly the same? The answer isn't just about gasoline. It's about branding, highways, standardization, and one of the quietest transformations in American architecture, one that happened right in front of us, one exit at a time. This is the story of the gas station. At its heart, this is a story about two very different questions. The first question belonged to an earlier America, an America of neighborhoods, streetcars, and main streets. When a gas station opened nearby, the question companies asked themselves was simple: how do we become part of this community? The second question belonged to a faster America, an America of interstates, suburbs, and long-distance travel. The question changed to something else entirely. How quickly can a driver, moving 65 miles an hour, recognize our name? Neither question was wrong. One reflects a country built around belonging. The other reflects a country built around speed. But somewhere between those two questions, something was lost. And to understand what and why it still matters, we have to go back to a time before gas stations existed at all. If you're enjoying the video, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this. Chapter 1. When filling up was an event. When automobiles first appeared on American streets, there were no gas stations. There didn't need to be. Cars were rare, expensive, and, for most Americans, still a novelty. In the earliest years of motoring, gasoline wasn't sold anywhere close to how we imagine it today. Drivers bought it from hardware stores, from pharmacies, from blacksmith shops and general stores, where it sat in barrels alongside nails, rope, and farm tools. Fuel was measured out by hand, pumped from drums, poured through funnels. It wasn't convenient, and it certainly wasn't safe. Gasoline is flammable. Storage methods varied wildly from shop to shop. As more automobiles crowded onto American roads, this improvised system, part hardware store, part fire hazard, became impossible to sustain. America needed a dedicated place to refuel. The question nobody had answered yet was simple, but strangely difficult. What should that place look like? The answer surprised almost everyone. Instead of resembling factories, the very first purpose-built gas stations tried to resemble homes. At the dawn of the automobile age, many Americans didn't trust these new fueling stations. They associated gasoline with fire, noise, and industrial machinery, the same instinct that made people uneasy about slaughterhouses or coal yards moving into their neighborhoods. Some residents worried that filling stations would make their streets less attractive or drag down property values. To ease those fears, oil companies and the architects they hired reached for something unexpected: make the gas station look like it belonged. As early as 1913, architect-designed filling stations began appearing across the country, shaped by the same City Beautiful movement that was giving America its grand train stations and civic buildings. Instead of bare industrial sheds, oil companies built stations with steep gabled roofs, brick chimneys, decorative windows, small gardens, even front porches. Some looked so convincingly like private homes that a passerby could easily mistake one for a neighbor's house. This wasn't decoration for its own sake. It was reassurance. If a building blended into the block it sat on, the thinking went, people were far more likely to accept it and to trust the company that built it. Visiting one of these early stations was also an entirely different experience than it is today. Attendants rushed out as a car pulled in. They filled the tank by hand, checked tire pressure, wiped down the windshield, checked the oil. Sometimes they offered directions or recommended a diner up the road. The gas station wasn't simply a place to buy fuel. It was a stop woven into the life of the town. For a traveler passing through, it was often the very first impression the place made. For a local resident, it became a familiar corner where neighbors traded news while their cars were serviced. And the architecture reflected exactly that role. These buildings weren't trying to disappear into the landscape. They were trying to make people feel at home. There was also a practical problem hiding behind the charm. The earliest stations were often little more than a pump and a small shed fine for dispensing fuel, but useless the moment a car needed a repair. As more Americans depended on their automobiles for daily life, they wanted somewhere nearby that could also check a leaking radiator, patch a tire, or replace a broken belt. So the gas station began to grow. Detached garages appeared behind the little cottages and bungalows, then attached ones. Service bays, designed to look like they belonged on a house rather than a factory floor, extended the residential illusion even as the buildings took on more industrial functions inside. It was, in its own way, an early lesson that would echo across the rest of this story. The moment a business needed to grow, it also needed to decide how much of its original character it was willing to sacrifice to do so. For now, in the 1920s, the answer was not much. The additions still wore chimneys, still wore shutters, still tried, however awkwardly, to look like they belonged on a residential street. Then, America's biggest oil companies realized something that would change everything. Beautiful buildings attracted customers, but recognizable buildings could attract even more of them. And that single realization would eventually reshape the American roadside. Chapter 2. Why gas stations looked like houses. To understand why so many early stations were built to resemble cottages and colonial homes, you have to remember what gasoline represented to the average American in the 1910s and 1920s. Danger. Early automobiles leaked fuel. Fires at fueling points weren't uncommon. Communities worried, often loudly, that a gas station would look and smell and sound like a dirty industrial plant dropped into the middle of a residential street. In many towns, this wasn't just an aesthetic preference. Local governments regulated exactly where stations could be built and expected new construction to fit into the existing streetscape. A station that looked like an oil refinery simply wouldn't get approved in some neighborhoods. A station that looked like an English cottage might. Oil companies understood something that still holds true in business today. People judge a company by the appearance of its building, long before they ever judge its product. So the companies softened the image, brick by brick. Brick instead of corrugated steel. Tile roofs instead of flat, bare concrete. Flower beds instead of open pavement. Leaded or decorative windows instead of blank warehouse walls. This wasn't a single company's idea, either. Across the country, independent local builders reached the same conclusion at roughly the same time that the surest way to win over a skeptical neighborhood was to make a filling station look less like a filling station. Sheds and stables were traded for something closer to a storybook illustration. It was, in a strange way, a kind of camouflage. Hide the machinery of the automobile age behind the comforting silhouette of an older one. One company in particular became closely associated with this approach. Pure Oil built what came to be known as cottage revival stations, small brick buildings with steep, blue-tiled roofs, a chimney, and bay windows, deliberately designed to look like something out of an English countryside storybook rather than a fuel depot. Examples of these little cottages still survive today, quietly repurposed as flower shops, real estate offices, and even bait shops. tucked into towns from Tennessee to Indiana. In Philadelphia, the ambition went even further. Atlantic Refining Company hired an architect named Joseph Kuntz to design a station at the corner of 40th and Walnut Streets, modeled after a classical Greek temple, complete with columns and gleaming white terracotta tile. It was, by any measure, a peculiar choice for a place that sold motor oil and gasoline. But it made a statement. Even a gas station could aspire to be a landmark. The architecture wasn't simply decorative. It was marketing, built in brick and tile instead of print advertisements. If a family trusted the building, they were far more likely to trust the company standing behind it. But by the time World War II ended, America itself had begun to change beneath these little cottages and temples. And suddenly, fitting into one particular neighborhood wouldn't matter nearly as much as being instantly recognized in 50 different states. Chapter 3: The Golden Age of the Gas Station. During the 1920s and 1930s, the automobile stopped being a novelty and became something closer to a necessity. As millions of new drivers took to the roads, oil companies found themselves competing over something they had never really had to compete over before: customer loyalty. Here was the problem. Gasoline itself wasn't dramatically different from one company's pumps to another's. A gallon was a gallon. So companies searched for another way to stand apart. They found it in architecture. Rather than building one generic filling station design and repeating it everywhere, many oil companies leaned into regional identity. In Virginia, Standard Oil favored colonial revival buildings that echoed the state's own architectural history. Farther south, Shell commissioned stations inspired by Spanish and Moorish design, borrowing the tile roofs and arched windows already familiar across parts of the Southeast. Across the American Southwest, companies adopted adobe forms rooted in the region's own building traditions. In New England, Tudor and cottage-style stations settled comfortably beside colonial churches and clapboard homes. The goal wasn't to make every station look identical. It was to make every single station feel like it had always belonged exactly where it stood. Some companies pushed this idea even further than architecture alone. Landscaping mattered. Uniform colors mattered. Even the posture of the attendants, trained to greet a car the moment it rolled onto the lot, became part of the overall impression a brand was trying to create. A gas station, during these decades, was closer to a piece of hospitality than a piece of industrial infrastructure. And for a brief window in the middle of the 20th century, that hospitality reached its absolute peak of ambition. And then, one of America's greatest architects decided that even a gas station deserved the same care as a museum. In 1958, Frank Lloyd Wright completed a building unlike anything the industry had ever seen: the R.W. Lindholm Service Station, in the small town of Cloquet, Minnesota. The story behind it began years earlier, almost by accident. In 1952, Wright had designed a private home for the Lindholm family. R.W. Lindholm happened to run a Phillips 66 fuel distributorship, and when Wright learned this, he mentioned that he'd long been interested in the design of gas stations, a subject that had quietly occupied his imagination for over 2 decades, tracing back to his sweeping, futuristic Brodecker City plan from the early 1930s. Lindholm gave him the chance. He would later describe the project simply as an experiment to see, in his words, whether a little beauty couldn't be incorporated into something as commonplace as a service station. Wright delivered far more than a little beauty. The finished building featured a dramatic, cantilevered copper canopy stretching more than 30 feet, a glass-walled observation lounge overlooking the Street, Louis River, and a soaring pylon sign reaching 60 feet into the sky. Wright had originally hoped to eliminate standing fuel pumps entirely, running fuel lines down through the canopy itself, an idea ultimately blocked by fire code standards of the era, so traditional ground pumps were installed instead. The station opened as a Phillips 66 outlet on the 31st of October 1958. It remains, to this day, the only gas station Frank Lloyd Wright ever designed that was actually built, and it still operates as a working fuel station, now recognized on the National Register of Historic Places. It stands as one of the only gas stations in the world regularly discussed as a genuine work of architecture. But Wright wasn't an outlier, because he alone cared about beauty. He simply represented the high point of an era when architecture still mattered even for the humblest business on the American roadside. Ironically, the very companies pouring money into these beautiful, individualized buildings were already quietly building the tools that would eventually replace them. If you want to discover more hidden stories behind the world around us, subscribe to the channel. Chapter 4. When the logo became more important than the building. The years following World War II transformed the American economy, and with it, the American landscape. Families moved into brand new suburbs. Highways expanded. Vacation travel, once a luxury, became something an ordinary family could plan for. Drivers were no longer simply buying gasoline a few blocks from home. They were buying it 200 miles from home, in towns they had never seen before and might never see again. That single shift changed everything about how a gas station needed to work. A traveler moving at highway speed, scanning an unfamiliar road for a place to stop, didn't have time to admire brick chimneys or tile roofs. They needed to recognize a name instantly, from a distance, without slowing down to look closely. So oil companies began asking a very different question than the one their predecessors had asked 30 years earlier. Not, how do we belong here? But how can someone identify our station from hundreds of yards away at 70 miles an hour? The answer wasn't another beautiful, one-of-a-kind building. It was branding. Bright, saturated colors, oversized logos, standardized signage that looked the same in Ohio as it did in Oregon, distinctive canopy shapes, uniform layouts, repeated at every location. No matter where a driver traveled, the brand became instantly recognizable. The same red, the same shell, the same star, wherever the highway happened to take them. Architecture, once the centerpiece of the strategy, became secondary. Recognition became everything. And then came a single piece of federal legislation that would finish the job the branding departments had started. Chapter 5. The highways changed everything. Before the interstate era, most American motorists drove directly through the center of town. Gas stations sat shoulder to shoulder with local shops along Main Street, their architecture contributing for better or worse to the character of the community around them. That changed on the 29th of June, 1956, when President Dwight Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, creating what would become the interstate highway system. Eisenhower's interest in the project traced back to his time in Germany during and after World War II, where he'd witnessed firsthand how effectively the German Autobahn network could move military convoys across the country. He came home convinced that America needed something comparable, both for national defense and for the ordinary business of getting people and goods from one place to another. The scale of what followed was staggering. The act authorized a network of more than 40,000 miles of controlled access highway, funded in large part by a gas tax increase from 2 cents to 3 cents a gallon. Within months, ground had already broken in Missouri on what would become Interstate 70. Within a decade, thousands of miles of new highway were reshaping how and where Americans traveled. For gas stations, the consequences were immediate and permanent. Cars now bypassed downtowns entirely, speeding past on elevated highways that skirted the edges of towns rather than running through their centers. New off-ramps and exits became the places where travelers actually stopped, not Main Street, not the town square, but an anonymous strip of land beside an interstate exit that hadn't existed a few years earlier. Gas stations no longer needed to charm the residents of the neighborhood around them. They needed to capture the attention of a driver who might be gone again in 90 seconds. Some historians have pointed out a small irony buried inside the interstate project itself. The system's popular nickname, the freeway, became, over time, one of the most effective pieces of branding in American public life. A vast, multi-decade construction project, paid for through gas taxes and federal spending, came to be known by a word that implied it cost nothing at all. The same instinct for simple, memorable branding that was reshaping gas stations was, at the very same moment, reshaping how Americans thought about the roads those stations sat beside. Large signs replaced detailed brickwork. Bright floodlighting replaced decorative craftsmanship. Wide, flat canopies sheltered multiple pumps at once, built for volume rather than character. Every design decision now prioritized visibility, speed, and convenience over the individuality that had once defined the industry. The American roadside had quietly become a commercial battlefield, and one simple architectural feature was about to win the war almost completely. Chapter 6. The canopy that took over America. By the late 1960s, a new design had become the unquestioned industry standard, coast to coast. A flat canopy stretching over several pumps at once. A simple, low rectangular building set behind it. Bold corporate colors. Large, internally lit signage. Generous parking. Easily accessible from the highway. This formula solved nearly every practical problem a station owner might have. It sheltered customers from rain and sun. It made a station instantly visible from a distance. It cut construction costs dramatically because materials and layouts could be standardized and shipped virtually anywhere in the country. Most importantly of all, it could be copied endlessly, in any state, at any exit, without hiring a single architect to design something unique. Within just a few years, nearly every major oil company had adopted some version of this same basic formula. The distinctive regional identities that had defined the Golden Age, the Spanish tile in the Southeast, the adobe forms of the Southwest, the Tudor cottages of New England, quietly disappeared beneath a wave of nearly identical canopies. By making every single station instantly recognizable, the industry had, almost by accident, made every roadside in America look the same. Chapter 7. When every exit became identical. As standardized gas stations spread across the interstate system, they rarely appeared alone. Fast food restaurants adopted the same playbook: bright colors, giant signs, instantly recognizable branding visible from a moving car. Motels followed. So did the new wave of convenience stores growing up alongside the pumps. Together, they created something that hadn't existed before: the modern American highway exit. A self-contained cluster of businesses that looked essentially the same whether you found it in Arizona, Ohio, Georgia, or Oregon. The same gas station, the same restaurants, the same convenience store, selling the same coffee and the same snacks. Corporate, standardized architecture had effectively replaced regional architecture. Consistency had become more valuable, commercially, than individual character. For businesses, the formula worked extraordinarily well. For time-pressed travelers, it reduced uncertainty. You always knew roughly what you'd find behind that familiar logo. But for a great many towns along the way, something quietly slipped out of view. Chapter 8. The roadside America we lost. Thousands of the ornate, individually designed filling stations built during the 1920s and 30s were eventually demolished to make way for the new standardized format. Others were remodeled so heavily they became unrecognizable. Some found second lives as auto repair shops, small restaurants, or local museums. In Philadelphia, a pair of old cottage-style stations even spent years as neighborhood water ice stands, their peaked roofs and chimneys serving out summer treats long after the gas pumps had gone silent. Only a fortunate few survived largely intact. Today, preservationists continue working to restore historic filling stations along Route 66 and other early American highways, not out of any particular nostalgia for gasoline itself, but because these small, unlikely buildings preserve the architectural record of an earlier version of the country. In America, where even a humble commercial building, put up to sell fuel and oil, was still expected to add something worthwhile to the street it stood on. In Kansas, a cottage-style station built in 1930 for local residents rather than long-distance travelers survives today as a visitor center. Its inviting, house-like design, chosen almost a century ago specifically to put nervous customers at ease, now serving the exact opposite purpose, drawing tourists in rather than reassuring the neighbors next door. In Texas, a station with a tower inspired, according to local legend, by the shape of a simple nail sketched on a napkin still stands as a small-town landmark, repurposed but not demolished. These survivors are the exception, not the rule. For every cottage-style station still standing, dozens more were quietly bulldozed, their brick and tile hauled away to make room for a flat canopy and a brighter sign. But the ones that did survive now carry a kind of weight their original builders never intended. They've become evidence, physical, walkable evidence of a version of American commerce that once valued fitting in over standing out. Ironically, the very buildings that nobody thought were worth protecting at the time have become some of the most photographed roadside landmarks in the country. Chapter 9. Why we still love the old ones. People don't drive hundreds of miles out of their way to photograph a modern gas station. They drive to photograph the old ones. Why? Because those older buildings have personality. Every roofline is a little different. Every window tells you something about the town it was built in. Every one of these stations reflects the specific place where it stands, rather than a single template repeated 1,000 times across the country. They're a physical reminder of an era before corporate architecture became standardized. A time when local identity still shaped the buildings people passed every day, and when businesses invested in beauty because they genuinely expected their buildings to last for generations, not just a single business cycle. These stations were never just selling fuel. In their own small way, they helped define the character of the towns that grew up around them. There's a reason a faded photograph of a cottage-style station, chimney and all, still stops people scrolling past it today. It doesn't just show a building, it shows a set of priorities, a moment when a company selling something as ordinary as motor fuel still felt obligated to contribute something worth looking at. That obligation is easy to romanticize, and it's worth being honest about its limits. Regional branding was still branding, and cottage roofs were still, in their own way, a marketing strategy. But it was a strategy that expressed itself through craftsmanship rather than signage, through belonging rather than repetition. That distinction is exactly what modern travelers seem to be responding to when they pull off the highway to photograph a building nobody, 60 years ago, expected anyone to remember. Chapter 10. The building we stopped seeing. The gas station never actually disappeared. Only its architecture did. The earliest filling stations were built around a simple, almost humble question. How can we become part of this community? Modern stations are built around a very different one. How quickly can a driver recognize our brand? Neither answer is entirely wrong. One reflects an America still organized around neighborhoods and main streets. The other reflects an America organized around highways, speed, and distance. The old filling station, with its brick chimney and tiled roof, quietly invited you to slow down. The modern gas station, with its flat canopy and glowing sign, is engineered to get you back on the road as quickly as possible. That, in the end, is the real story. America didn't wake up one day and simply stop caring about beautiful buildings. It gradually, almost invisibly, began valuing consistency over individuality, recognition over craftsmanship, efficiency over character. And it did this one exit, one canopy, one standardized sign at a time, until the change was essentially complete before most people had ever noticed it happening. Today, every time you pull beneath a familiar corporate canopy to fill your tank, you're standing inside the result of decisions made decades earlier, decisions made back when branding first became more important than architecture. And somewhere along that long, quiet journey, one of the most beautiful buildings in an American town became one of the easiest buildings to overlook entirely. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe for more.